right, good morning, everybody. So today we're going to, this is going to be kind of like a test week. Second, it's going to be a test week for us. So I'm going to be posting the test on Power School later on today. You probably won't be able to finish the test until the information that we do on Wednesday. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be, let me make sure this pulls up. It does. We're going to be going through speciation. Use red. So speciation. And speciation is just a way of saying it's a process. Let me erase that. There we go. It's a process by which new species form. You can tell I haven't used a computer in a few days. So it's a process by which new species form. This is the reason that this exists is so that we can kind of identify differences between like two different types of species, or to say like, okay, this is actually a new species compared to other ones which may just be similar. And so there's two types that we're going to go through. So two types, and that is sympatric, which is where there is no separation. I should say that's geological separation, and then there's allopatric, where there is separation. And what do I mean by separation? So you have, let's say, animal one, and this is the same thing, animal one, right? And then there is a rift that's formed between them. Actually, let's say it's a river. Let's say a river flows between them, and they're separated for a long enough amount of time, and there's no migration. Then eventually this species will change. Maybe it gets a little bit bigger, and it's considered to be a separate species because it has this separation. And and then sympatric is when there's no river; they just diverge in different ways. All right. So with some of this, it's the idea of a species is pretty intuitive. You don't need to be a zoologist to be able to classify things like when you look at humans and bears and plants and things like that, and you can kind of group them by their appearances. And this was what was done for kind of the longest time. And it seems like it's pretty easy, right? It seems like it's pretty easy until you get this example right here. So wow, the zoom on that is incredibly useless. So looking at this example right here, all right, so if you were to look at this and there were no labels at the bottom, could you tell the difference between an African fish eagle and a bald eagle? Well, I'm sure if you had enough time and, of course, better quality pictures than this, you might be able to, looking at like minute details. You know, this one has kind of a little black speck on its nose while this one doesn't, but that could just be differences in the species. You can count feathers. You can look at how their feet are arranged and how they function. But looking at these, you might consider them to be the same species. All right. But then look at kind of on the reverse of that, you have this Chihuahua and this Great Dane. Are these the the same species? Well, yes, they are. They're both dogs, domesticated dogs to be exact. So this is where you kind of run into these gray areas, because how is it that the eagles were considered to be different species, but these animals weren't? And so that's when you start to get into a lot of other things. So you look at, like, okay, yes, you could look at the difference between eukaryotes, prokaryotes. You can look at reproductive compatibility. You can look at common ancestors. And so a lot of this stuff, it does come, it is very, very difficult. All right. And one of the things that we sort of struggle with is this thing called the biological species. I don't know why I struggle with E's. Species concept. So biological species concepts. This is when a group of organisms can interbreed or mate and produce viable offspring. So they have to be able to breed and produce viable offspring. We're just gonna undo that one and start over. Offspring. Oh my god, I'm really struggling today. So viable, meaning that they are able to breed and produce offspring themselves. Viable meaning that they are able to reproduce. If you look at members of the same species, they are able to introduce. So like a dog living in Australia versus a dog living in the US are unlikely to ever meet, but if they did, they could reproduce and they could produce offspring. So for instance, I have a dachshund. He could potentially reproduce with a dachshund anywhere in the world, while those eagles, the African fish eagle and the bald eagle, might not necessarily be able to do so. In order to be considered a single species, usually it has to be able to produce healthy, fertile offspring when they interbreed. But in some cases, organisms can mate and produce healthy offsprings, but they're infertile and they can't reproduce. So this is where you enter kind of a gray territory. So in my front yard, I have a London plane tree. And this is, let me look up the actual, okay, that's what I thought it was. So the scientific name of this is Platanus X acerifolia. And the key part of this is this X. And what that represents is that this is a hybrid. So this is a hybrid between a old world sycamore or an oriental plane tree and an American sycamore. So this is pretty new, because this species did not exist until colonization of the US happened, and Europeans were able to bring those trees or bring trees with them and allow that hybridization to happen. And then once it did, the London plane tree pops up. It's a really common street tree. It exfoliates bark, so it's really easy to tell. Another example that I have is a mule. So this is a combination of a horse and a donkey. Why does this exist? Well, because they they're extremely strong. They have the best of what a horse has with the strength and the endurance, and the best of what a donkey has. And so these are really common animals. The problem is, try as hard as it may, mules cannot reproduce, even with other mules, or they cannot reproduce with horses or donkeys. And it's because of how their chromosomes line up. So we had talked about that before in genetics, and we'll go over it a little bit later on today. But these are perfectly healthy animals. As you can see, this one, it's got some cargo strap to it, and it can do mule related activities and things like that. It just cannot reproduce. So this is where the biological concept of species kind of lead into this process of evolution, because members of a species can sometimes interbreed as long as they have a common gene pool. But that doesn't mean that the genes will be exchanged between species. So even if they can combine their DNA, like in the case of this mule, a lot of times the offspring will be sterile and unable to pass on the genes. And so then there's this big question: is this considered to be a species? Because species, remember, have to have the ability to reproduce, and this one doesn't. And that's where you can kind of run into some issues with, like, you have this animal that was produced and is living by all counts that we say it's living, but it just can't reproduce. So is it considered to be a species? And so there's different ways that we can have like this barrier. So one of the terms you'll hear me talk about is reproductive isolation. And this is a fancy way of saying they cannot reproduce with another species. All right. So there are what are called, so you have different types. So the first one we're going to talk about is, I don't know why I'm really struggling with E's today. So pre-zygotic barrier. There are 5 types of these that we're going to talk about. All right. So the first one is habitat. This is where they just don't live together. They're separated, and they're unlikely to encounter each other because there is some sort of distinction between their habitat. So for example, comparing a species so going back to the dog example, I should have muted that. Going back to the dog example, a dog in Australia versus a dog in the United States, that would be considered habitat isolation. So they are unlikely to meet each other because of that barrier. This is if they were wild and if they were different species. The second one is temporal, and think of temporal as time. So this can either be they exist at different types of the years, there's some sort of time element that separates them. So for example, if you had a species that only emerged on odd years and another species that emerged on even years, they are temporally separated. If you have a species that it produces flowers in May versus a species that produces flowers in June or July, those are going to be temporally separated. For example, last month in April, there were plants in my backyard that produce flowers. Those are going to be temporally separated from the plants that produce flowers once we start to go into once we get into June and July, because there's that time difference. All right, so that would be a temporal difference. The third one is behavioral. And this is where one of them is just unattracted to the other because of some reason, right? So you could think of cardinals as an example. Cardinals that are bright red are the ones that attract a mate. So males have that bright red coloring. Now, if you were to have another bird species that was not bright red, obviously cardinals are not going to be attracted to them because they don't have that characteristic. Frogs that have a really loud mating call are the ones that attract mates, and so not being able to call out for a mate, that would be considered an unattractive behavior that it has. So that leads to a separation where they won't be able to mate. Number 4 is gametic. This is gametes. All right, this is where the sperm and egg cells cannot combine. All right, they can't meet up. There's something that doesn't allow those cells to interact with each other. In humans, we have polarization of the cell membrane of an egg that happens after fertilization, and that prevents double fertilization from happening. We know that mistakes can happen or errors can happen in that, but either way, there is this kind of barrier that happens, and so that limits the interactability among cells, mostly among multiple sperm cells with one egg. And other so thinking about plants, in some plants, the pollen is just shaped incorrectly in order to interact with the flowers of other species. So that would be or if it makes it down to it, it would be unable to reproduce with that. And then the last one is mechanical. And this is where they just physically can't mate. All right, this is where the reproductive structures just don't fit together properly. And so a lot of times, like, you could think about, like, can a Great Dane and a Chihuahua mate? Well, yeah, but mechanically that would be pretty tough. And so going back to the reference with the mule, when I was in South Dakota, we ran into a guy that actually told us like how draft mules are made, and it involves like the construction of ramps and things like that, and so that's to help overcome a lot of that mechanical barrier. But mechanical is where they just physically can't match up together. All right, so those are pre-zygotic. This is before the zygote. So zygote being the cell that forms right after the combination of sperm and egg. So that is pre-zygotic. Now there is post-zygotic. There is a post-zygotic barrier. I'm not going to copy barrier, but there is post-zygotic. And so post-zygotic is where they can combine, but usually the chromosome mismatch will be lethal and they're unlikely to survive. They'll be unhealthy. They'll be unfertile. So this is how a mule works out, because if you have your chromosomes, let's say blue is horse and red is donkey, it comes out something like that, or they'll just be increasingly longer than what they should be. So that's post-zygotic, where there's just something there on the molecular level that doesn't allow them to produce healthy or viable offspring. All right. So both of those things can happen. So how do new species arise? So that is where we have speciation. So speciation is actually the process of forming new species, like what we said earlier. All right. So speciation being the process of forming new species. And so in this, this is where ancestors kind of split from one another and they can no longer interbreed due to reasons that we had discussed earlier. So an example that kind of came out of one of Darwin's ideas that has been redrawn to look a little bit better is looking at elephants. So you have kind of your original species down here at the bottom. So you can think of species being along, I guess, the hypothetical x-axis and the y-axis being time. All right. So modern day tends to be closer to the top, while the past tends to be closer to the bottom. So you have kind of this movement through time. So these two species are different from each other, but they do share a relative back here. And so when two new populations are formed from an original population, they evolve in a way that it becomes impossible for individuals of the new species to interbreed. And a lot of times we being biologists kind of break that into two categories, which I talked about earlier, allopatric and sympatric. So allo meaning other and patric meaning homeland. So and then sympatric, sim meaning same, patric meaning homeland. So allopatric meaning that there is a geographical separation, sympatric meaning that they share a species but there's no geographical barrier in here. So we're going to go through allopatric first, since it tends to be the most common. So with allopatric, they evolve from the same descendant, but they're physically separated. A mountain range, rock slide, river, some sort of barrier pops up, and it splits the population long enough that it starts to separate these species. So over time, populations become separated after some members cross kind of a pre-existing barrier. Like, for example, members of a mainland population that become isolated on an island that they might fly to or fly over to, that they can no longer make that journey back. And when they become reproductively isolated, they undergo genetic divergence. And when this happens, they become gradually genetically different, and so their heritability characteristics are modified over that. And again, this is a form of natural selection. You know, they've went to a new place and they are instantly separated. So as they diverge, the groups evolve different from what they were originally. So they evolve different traits that act and it can be pre-zygotic or post-zygotic barriers. So if one group evolves a large enough body size, they might not be able to physically mate, being a mechanical barrier for pre-zygotic. Even if those populations are put back together. And if it's strong enough, it may actually prevent gene flow, and the groups are going to keep evolving on their separate paths. So we're going to look at a case study, and the case study involves Grand Canyon. All right. So for those of you who had not seen the Grand Canyon, I know it sounds really weird, but when I was in elementary school, my teacher, we had chalkboards back then. Computers were like new. And I know someone in the chat's going to type in, well, it's because you went to school and dinosaurs roamed the earth, which is not the case. But the way that my teacher always drew it was the Grand Canyon is this hole that a river runs through it. And so I literally thought, like, this is what it looks like. I didn't realize that a better drawing would have been like, here's a valley, and then here's another valley, and then it kind of, I guess they kind of like, it heads down. And the same thing on this side where it kind of heads down into this valley. And then this valley is filled with water. But legit, like, and I wasn't a dumb kid, but it was one of those things that, like, I didn't know because I'd never left Kendallville. Like, I grew up in Kendallville, like I never left. So I legit thought that this is what the Grand Canyon was like. And I always wondered, like, because they were like, oh yeah, there's like snakes and stuff at the bottom of this. And I'm like, how did this area like not fill up with water and become a lake? Like, how did that not happen? Is this like a magical place? Because I never been to the Grand Canyon. I know that's kind of a weird side story, but like yeah. Okay, so Grand Canyon, this is what it looks like. It's not a hole with water flowing over top of it, but water kind of eroded these rocks away, and you can see the striations over time in the Grand Canyon with newer rock beat up at the top and then older stuff at the bottom. But this is a pretty large separation, even between like going from, let's say, this point over here to this point over here. Like, that's a pretty decent separation that's happening, and many species won't be able to make its way down the rocks, across the water, and then back up these other rocks. Like, that's a pretty difficult journey. And then on top of that, you have snakes at the bottom of this that apparently just kind of exist. And so what happened was there was a group of squirrels. Don't remember the name of the squirrels, what they were beforehand, but this is north-south. All right, this is a north-south direction. And so one group is on the north side of squirrels and one group is on the south side when this becomes too large to make that cross. And that is these two types of squirrels. So you have the Harris's antelope squirrel on the south side, and then on the north side you have the white-tailed antelope squirrel. Now, these probably came from the exact same species as squirrel. It's just as that geographical barrier of the Grand Canyon built up over time, you end up with this split, and now you have these two separate animals. They are reproductively isolated. If you get them together and allow them to mate, they cannot. So that is an example of allopatric speciation. All right. The only version for sympatric speciation that I can think of is a plant, which I couldn't find a picture of because I don't remember the exact species of plant. But a lot of times it involves modification in chromosome numbers. And so we'll talk about that. So my beautiful Grand Canyon drawing. We're going to, or the next thing is talking about polyploidy. So polyploidy, poly means many, ploidy is chromosomes. So this means many chromosomes. So we had talked about humans being 2n. N is the number of chromosomes in a gamete or a reproductive cell. So we have 2n, meaning that we have, so for humans, n is 23 in humans, meaning that you get 23 chromosomes from each of your parents. So in total, our 2n number is 46. We have 46 chromosomes total. But that's not always the case. All right, there's some that increase their chromosome count or decrease their chromosome count. For the most part, it's increased. So how could that lead to speciation? So as an example, let's assume you have a tetraploid plant, right? 2n or 4n. So it has 4 sets of chromosome, and then all of a sudden a diploid set with 2n pops up. Are they going to be able to actually mate? Well, let's look at a picture. I have a picture. This is a really bad picture. Let me see if I can copy this and paste it and get a. Is this, and that one's messed up too. Okay, so let me just draw this out then, I guess. All right, so I'm gonna need a new paint document. So you have your starting cell. Zoom into 200%. We'll do, so you have this is a diploid plant. All right, and let's say it has chromosome set 1, We'll do red for chromosome set 2, and then we'll do purple for set 3. So it goes through. There's an error. All right, so an error occurs, and during this, you end up keeping the original amount. All right, you keep the original amount as before, rather than them splitting. So then, if they were to reproduce, and plants are capable of doing that, you now have going from 2N to 4N. So you have tetraploid now. Because this has an extra set in there, this is going to make its compatibility with other plants not exactly work out. So how does that work? All right, so this is a little line here. So you have your original 2N, right? And you have your new 4N plant over here. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, there's your chromosomes. Then all of a sudden, they go into their haploid state. This becomes 2N instead. So then you have 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. So why did this happen? Well, remember that when you go through meiosis, so this is meiosis, meiosis, that you end up cutting your chromosome count in half. So in this step, we've reduced the number of each chromosome down. So technically 2 cells are produced at the end product of this. And then, well, 4 are produced in total, but now these 2 plants combine together. So from here you get 1 red chromosome, and from here you get 2. From this one you get 1 blue chromosome, and from this one you get 2. And then from this one you get 1 purple chromosome from this one and from that one. And this will either be non-viable or infertile because it is now tetraploid, or triploid, sorry. So it's triploid. Now, triploid is really common in plants. Okay, that's for an example in a second. So triploid is actually kind of common in plants. So because the triploid or the tetraploid and diploid plants came together and cannot produce a viable offspring, then we're going to consider them to be 2 separate species. So that's reproductive isolation. And because if this is non-viable, if this is non-viable, it is prezygotic, and if it is infertile, it is postzygotic. All right, so it goes in 2 separate paths based off of whether it is prezygotic or postzygotic, or whether it's non-viable or infertile. All right, so speciation by polyploidy, it's super common in plants, but it tends to be a lot more rare in animals, and this is how you end up with a common version of sympatric speciation. Now, sympatric speciation without polyploidy. All right, so there's some debate as to how important or common this mechanism is. All right, but the answer is yes. You can have sympatric speciation without polyploidy. So it happens when a subspecies, so sympatric speciation may take place when when subgroups in a population use different habitats or resources. All right, so there's some sort of competition and it drives another one to change that. So an example is the North American apple maggot fly. So as the name suggests, it feeds and mates on apple trees, but the original ones fed upon hawthorns. So it's when European settlers introduced apple trees, that's when these started to exploit that as a food source. All right, so flies that were born on apples tended to feed and mate with other flies that were born on apples, while those that were born and fed and born on hawthorns tend to stick with hawthorns. So that population ended up subdividing, even though they were within proximity of each other. They did encounter each other, and there's no reason why an apple fly could not fly over to a hawthorn tree, or a hawthorn fly fly over to an apple tree, or I guess hawthorns are bushes. But over time, they started to kind of diverge. They are genetically distinct. They have their own group of adaptations. And because of that, they're now considered to be different species. Like the apple fly and the hawthorn fly emerge at different times of the year, so that would be a temporal separation. They're genetically different, and because of that, they're now considered to be separate species. There's still some interbreeding that does occur, so they're not 100% separate yet, but it is making its way that way. All right. So let me turn my light on so that when I switch to camera, close these, don't save, don't save, don't save, and don't save. Make sure that my camera is actually working. It is. Okay, so to kind of sum up everything that we went over today, this biological species concept basically just defines like what is considered to be a species. So it is the ability to produce and interbreed to make healthy, fertile organisms. All right. Mules are healthy, sterile organisms. They are not fertile. They cannot reproduce. But there's a lot of different species concepts, and you can see how hard it is in order to sit here and distinguish, like, this is a new species and this isn't. So you have prezygotic and postzygotic separations. So prezygotic being the 5 examples that we went through. Postzygotic meaning that for that example, the mule, think of that where they can combine, but it produces either an unhealthy or a sterile organism, an infertile organism. And so these barriers keep organisms of different species from mating and producing fertile offspring, either pre or postzygotic. And so that leads to reproductive isolation. Are there exceptions to this? Yes, we talked about a sunflower species a couple weeks ago that is sterile, or is viable, is healthy, can reproduce, is a hybrid. So are those species considered to be reproductively isolated if they can form a hybrid that is viable? So the 2 big types, you have allopatric, which is allo meaning that they're separate, sympatric meaning they're the same, that they're together. So allopatric speciation means that there is a geographical barrier. Sympatric means that there is not a geographical barrier that exists. So polyploidy. So when you hear that, think about polyploidy or the flies. All right, that's everything that I have for today. Again, we're going to be, this is going to be a week where I'm going to post a test. We are still going to continue with evolution. I just wanted to post a test. The way that tests are going to work is that you will do the test. You have the week to do it. You turn that in, and then once you turn the test in, then you get graded on it, and that will replace an older test grade. And as you know, test grades are extremely important. So this is a big chance for you to improve your grade if you need to. But that is all I have for today. I'm going to use the bathroom, and then we will be over in Google Meets momentarily. So I will see everybody there. Thank you for watching.